Hello, and welcome back to 50 States, 50 Murders, the podcast taking you, the listener, on an auditory road trip across all 50 states while discussing 50 different murders. Thank you all for tuning in to episode 9. Dakota, where will we be traveling to today?
We're going to Columbia, Missouri to discuss the murder of Jesse Valencia.
If you have not tuned in to last week's episode, please be sure to do so. We were in the evergreen state of Washington. As we pick up our things and venture out, we arrive in this week's state of Missouri. Washington, Missouri makes for a 27-hour, 1,800-mile trek. As we set up shop here in the state of Missouri, we will be covering a murder that took place 19 years ago. But before diving into this week's case, let's talk all things Missouri. Attractions, things to do, things to see, as well as some notorious murders that happen to take place here. Missouri is nicknamed the Show Me State. This is a little bit disappointing. After doing a little bit of research, there's actually no real reason for the nickname. I feel like that's half the fun of a nickname. It's got to have a reason behind it. Missouri's gridlocked in central USA. Right of Kansas, left of Illinois, above Arkansas, and under Iowa. So, we talked about how Kansas is in the middle. This is pretty much right there with it. Murder per capita. It's actually second in all 50 states. 11.8 murders per 100K. So we finally have a state here that's ranking towards the top. And I'll tell you why Missouri is so high, and that's because last year, St. Louis, Missouri ranked as the most dangerous city in the USA. Before I dive into it, does that surprise you at all?
As the most dangerous? Yeah, I was thinking maybe like Detroit, Chicago. I knew it was up there, but I didn't know it was number one.
Yeah, I was kind of surprised. For some reason, I was thinking New Orleans. I feel like Louisiana's always up there. You mentioned Chicago, Detroit. But yeah, it's actually St. Louis, Missouri. And, fun fact, this year it actually had the honor of going back-to-back for the top spot. Most dangerous city in the USA.
Impressive.
Very impressive. St. Louis ranks well above the national average of violent crimes as well as property-related crimes. St. Louis plays a major role in Missouri ranking second in all states for murder per capita. Here in St. Louis, you can see the Gateway Arch, check out a Cardinals baseball game, and potentially end up murdered all in one day. Dakota, I mentioned the Gateway Arch, which is Missouri's top attraction. It's the tallest monument in the USA, and it's the biggest arch in the world. But there are other things to see than just the arch. But before moving on, is that something you'd want to see? Does that look interesting to you?
No, it's like the Bean in Chicago.
Yeah, it looks kind of boring. I don't know if it's one of those things where you see it online, it doesn't look that great. Maybe you see it in real life, and it's like, oh, this is actually pretty cool. I kind of felt that way about Mount Rushmore.
Oh, yeah.
I always thought it was kind of going to be overrated, and then I saw it in real life, and I was like, oh, yeah, I get it. This is pretty cool. So I don't know if the arch is the same thing, but just looking at photos, it looks pretty boring. So besides that, let's see what we got here. We have the Silver Dollar City. This is a 1800s themed amusement park. 40 rides, 18 restaurants, 13 acres dedicated to their water park, shops, and live entertainment. Here's my problem with this. Just because, we live in Ohio, we already have Cedar Point. So I don't know if I'd want to personally venture out for an amusement park myself. But you like amusement parks. You like roller coasters.
Yeah, I mean, 80 or 1800s theme, that sounds interesting.
Yeah.
I've never heard of this place.
Yeah, I feel like you would like that.
I'll definitely have to look that up.
It's up your alley.
See, I love amusement parks. I just don't like the lines at Cedar Point.
Okay, so up next we have something I think is a little bit more your speed. We have the Mark Twain Boyhood Home and Museum. Obviously, Mark Twain, one of the greatest American authors of all time. And this museum and home is located in Hannibal, Missouri. Here you can see his childhood home and museum. Also worth mentioning, in Hannibal there is an infamous cave that he writes about in 5 different novels. This is the same cave that served as a hiding place for the notorious bank robber Jesse James. We have the Titanic Museum. Now, I don't know if this is something that interests you. If you're a big Titanic lover, if you love the movie, maybe you make your way to Missouri for this. It's located in Branson, Missouri. Here you can board on a replica Titanic and learn all things about the popular unsinkable ship who did just what it couldn't do. You can walk the hallways, cabins, as well as the grand staircase. This is something I thought was pretty cool. Inside, there are over 400 artifacts that were collected from the real ship as well as its real passengers.
That's interesting. Why did they choose middle of Missouri to put this Titanic museum?
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting. Middle of America, no oceans. There it sits, just the Titanic Museum.
Yeah, this place is interesting. I've seen videos of it. They have like a staircase you walk by, and it's just flooding, and it's like the real thing.
Cool.
Yeah.
Sweet. Maybe lose your life here at the Titanic Museum. Okay, and the last thing I have here, this is something I kind of threw on just for me and you. I don't know if it's cheeky or not, but it's the Lakes of Ozark. It was towards the bottom of the list, but I had to throw it on here. It's located in Osage Beach, Missouri. Basically, it's just a collection of lakes where you can boat, fish, water sport, hike. You can go horseback riding at the 2 public beaches, and as well as a cave system off the water. Now, Dakota, this is big for me and you because we love the Netflix series Ozarks. It's a money laundering show that is set in the Ozarks here in Missouri. Now, the show actually wasn't filmed here, but nonetheless, I still think it'd be cool to visit, see the waterways, and see what the Ozarks is all about.
It was in Georgia, right?
It was in Georgia,
Yeah,
yes.
You visited.
Yeah, I actually got to see a couple spots where it was really filmed. But yeah, the Lakes of Ozarks, I think that would be cool just to check it out. Basically, if you're local, if you're listening to us, we have Portage Lakes. I got to imagine it's like Portage Lakes, except it's just like times 1,000. Just Portage Lakes on
People love
steroids.
the Portage Lakes.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm sure it's a pretty cool vibe. So if you're in Missouri, I feel like those are some really cool things to check out. So now that we've become a little bit more familiar with Missouri, let's go ahead and jump into some notorious murders that happen to take place here in the Show Me State.
Yeah, so some of the most famous murder cases that have happened in the state are actually criminals being murdered.
Oh, okay.
So more recently, 70s, 80s, there were 2 criminals. One was the guy who has been arrested over 20 times. He was murdered. Still unsolved. It's the most popular unsolved case in Missouri. But the death of notorious robber Jesse James, you mentioned him earlier, he was killed by one of the only people he trusted. And another one that happened is known as the Kansas City Massacre. This was a shootout in 1933. It took place at Kansas City's Union Station Railroad Depot. It was an attempt by a gang to free Frank Jelly Nash, and it resulted in the death of 4 law enforcement officers and Nash himself. So the guy they were trying to free ended up getting killed. And although the FBI pointed to Vernon Miller, Adam Rachetti, and Charles Pretty Boy Floyd, there's some evidence that Floyd wasn't actually involved. I couldn't find why they thought that, but I just saw on the couple pages that he might not have been involved with it. This incident changed a lot within the FBI. Afterwards, agents were allowed to carry firearms and make arrests. So that was interesting.
Yeah.
So basically, they knew he was going to be transported to prison at this railroad depot, and they just staked it out. And then when they came through, they just started shooting. And it didn't say if Nash was killed by friendly fire or if the cops killed him. Interesting.
It's almost it's like strange that there was a time where they weren't allowed to have guns on them. So it's okay.
Yeah. I'm not sure who they were shooting at or who was shooting back if
right,
if they weren't allowed to carry guns, but it said they could they weren't allowed to, but some carried their own personal weapons.
Okay, I gotcha.
Yeah. So illegal firearms by police.
Okay.
Being carried.
Very cool.
And next one is one that I never heard of until I looked into it.
Yeah, it's new to me.
May 22nd, 1962, a flight carrying 45 people crashed in Unionsville, Missouri. Only one person survived the initial crash, but they later died in the hospital. And it turns out the flight had been bombed. There was a passenger on board. His name was Thomas Dottie. He was able to sneak 6 sticks of dynamite into his briefcase, and he ignited them shortly before they were set to arrive in Kansas City. He did this because he wanted his wife and daughter to collect on his life insurance policy that he purchased shortly before. And today's money, it would have been upwards of $2 million. But since it was ruled a suicide, his wife was actually not able to collect on it.
Oh, man. He didn't really think that through. You're just up there in the sky lighting dynamite. Man, there could have been so many better ways to do it. What an interesting move.
Yeah, so he took out 45 total people, and his wife and kid now don't have him, and they don't have the money. So,
yeah.
The next thing I want to get into, so all the serial killers that we've covered in other states, they're active in the 70s, 80s, because it was harder for police to catch them back then. Now, Terry Blair and Maury Travis were two 21st century serial killers that operated in the early 2000s. Blair's first victim was actually in the 80s, his pregnant ex-girlfriend, but somehow he got paroled in 2002, and then he went on to kill 6 more women. Travis killed in between 12 and 17 women in a span of a year. He was tracked down by the help of Microsoft.
Bill Gates.
Now, do you remember the Pensacola naval base shooting back in 2019?
A little bit, yeah.
So it was a terrorist attack, and afterwards the police tried to get into the terrorist phone and see if there were more planned, they're trying to get some help to prevent more damage.
And this is where Apple refused to help, basically.
Yeah,
okay.
They refused to help him, but this wasn't the case for Travis. He tried boasting in the papers about one of his murders, and he made a map, and police were able to go to Microsoft and find out where the map was made, and that's how they were able to catch him.
Interesting. Okay. So we have some pretty wild stories coming out of Missouri. Very interesting cases. So now that we've done a deep dive in the state of Missouri, what you can do, what you can see, as well as some infamous cases that happen to take place here, let's go ahead and dive into this week's case of Jesse Valencia.
All right, so today's case takes us back to the date of June 5th, 2004. A murder victim was discovered in Columbia, Missouri, which is a college town where the University of Missouri is. Early in the morning, a student walked out of his apartment and saw a body just laying on the ground, and there was blood surrounding the body, so he quickly called the police. And when the police arrived, they weren't able to identify the victim because they had no identification on him. But other students in the surrounding area were able to help identify police that it was the body of Jesse Valencia.
All right, so let's talk about Jesse a little bit here. Just a little bit of a callback, unintentionally. Jesse James Valencia. He was born on his family farm in 1981 in the state of Kentucky. He was one of 3 children in the home, himself and 2 sisters. Jesse was 23 at the time of his murder, and as we mentioned, Boone County, Columbia, Missouri. This is where Jesse was murdered. Here in Columbia, Jesse was a student at the University of Missouri. Prior to his murder, he was a junior on campus studying both journalism as well as pre-law.
Yeah, so he was actually double majoring. He was in journalism and history, and he wanted to go on to medical school. But something I thought or found interesting was his mom did an interview with Dateline NBC, and she talked about how he used to love to write poems. And before his death, or actually I think they found it after his death, but a couple days before, because he marked a journal entry, he wrote that he knew he was going to die young, which is very strange. This isn't the first case I've heard something like this. Going back to Columbine, the first victim in that was Rachel Scott. She was the very first person killed. She had the same journal entry that she knew she was going to die young. It's very strange how these people just know that. They knew they were going to be murdered. That's kind of weird.
Yeah, some intuition. That is kind of creepy.
Yeah.
So that's what he was doing in school. Outside of school, Jesse worked at a motel near campus, and also, I didn't see how long this was, but after high school, he spent some time as a model.
Okay. Upon arriving at campus, Jesse was openly gay, but he was accepted and supported by loved ones and close to him. He was just like any other college kid, partying, taking classes whenever he wasn't partying. And from all accounts, he seemed like a good kid. No record, no major problems. And for someone studying pre-law, it was important to stay on the right side of the law. There was only one hiccup. 2 months before his murder, police were called to break up a party on campus. There were some noise complaints. They were all just being too loud. This wasn't a party that he was hosting personally, but he was not happy about it. So the responding officer, a guy by the name of Officer Rios, he handled the call, arrived on scene, and Jesse started to argue with him. So Rios arrested him for disorderly conduct.
Okay, so something else that's worth mentioning here, while it's not a crime by any means, certainly not abnormal for a college student, Jesse was known to have multiple regular hookup partners. As we always make mention, when it comes to murders, generally the first suspect is always going to be your partner, the person you're in a relationship with, your spouse, your husband, your wife. With Jesse having multiple partners at the time of this murder, it was definitely going to make things a lot harder for the police. Prior to his open relationships, Jesse did have an ex-boyfriend of 2 years, Jack Berry. Jack arrived to Boone, Missouri distraught after hearing rumors Jesse had been killed. He reached out to the Valencia family to notify them of the news. Police then took him in for questioning and was officially suspect number 1.
Now, he wasn't a current partner, but he was still a former partner of 2 years. And Jack told police that he and Jesse had some recent troubles after breaking up. Jesse was still in love with him, but Jack had moved on, so this caused some problems between the two. And when asked about his whereabouts, he just said he was at home sleeping. So with what you could call as somewhat of a motive, not an actual alibi, Jack was not only the first suspect, but now he is the prime suspect. Confiscated from Jesse's apartment was his cell phone, and he actually had a call the night that he was murdered at 3:18 in the morning to Jack. It was around this time that Jack mentioned he was in bed and he heard a knock at his door. Police had no solid concrete evidence on Jack, so they were forced to continue the investigation and look at other possible suspects.
Okay, so enter suspect number 2. We have a suspect named by multiple friends, and that suspect was Zev Fintek. Zev was someone Jesse had met 2 weeks prior at a political rally. Now, there was something a little bit off about Zev. He was someone who was believed to have been gay, but wasn't like Jesse in the sense that he was not open about it. There was some suspicions that the two of them had been in a romantic relationship because in those 2 weeks they were together frequently, all the time. Witness accounts started to come forward. One said they saw someone matching Zev's description walking down the road crying the morning the body was discovered. Another saw a car matching his in the area very early in that morning. His alibi was that he had been home sleeping at his parents' house, and they were able to confirm him being at the house sleeping, and this took him off of the list of suspects.
So you mentioned that Jesse liked to sleep around. So from there, police had to go down the list of his partners, and the next suspect leads us to Ed McDevitt. They had met a week before the murder, but they quickly hit off. Multiple witnesses said they saw the two leaving a party together around 3 a.m. the morning of the 5th. At this time, Ed has 2 criminating qualifications against him. McDevitt was believed to be a sexual partner, as well as the last person that we know has seen our victim alive. Now, Ed claimed that they went their separate ways, and his alibi was going home, and his roommate was able to confirm this, that he was shortly home after 3 a.m.
Police were able to eliminate Ed because of a witness account from Jesse's neighbor. Living in an apartment that had paper-thin walls, he was able to hear a lot that went on next door. Around 4 a.m. on the morning of the 5th, this neighbor said he was woke up by loud bangs and what sounded like arguing in Jesse's apartment, where he had hit on the door to ask him to quiet down. With Ed's alibi putting him home around 3 and Valencia's neighbor accounting for Jesse being alive at 4 a.m., police were forced to move on from who was their most likeliest suspect at the time.
What police were able to gather from the scene were some hair fibers not of Jesse's own on his chest. They were able to recover some DNA from under his fingernails. Now, the autopsy report stated that there was no defensive wounds, making it believe that it was a sneak attack from behind. Unfortunately, from the DNA recovered, there was no match in the system, and it did not sync up with any of our 3 suspects listed. So the evidence at the time did not prove to be much assistance yet.
Police were forced to continue moving on, and they got some luck as they were able to gather some information about Jesse's life the day after his murder from a guy named Andy Schermerhorn. Andy was another one of Jesse's hookups, and Andy was forthcoming with quite an interesting piece of information here. He informed police of another relationship of Jesse's that the police were not aware of. In fact, only Andy and very few were aware of this secret relationship. The secret relationship was with a Columbia police officer. 3 weeks prior, while Andy was with Jesse, a police officer knocked at the door and came in. Full pun. Upon this unnamed police officer entering the premises, it led to the 3 of them fooling around. Upon leaving, the officer was adamant this needed to be kept as a secret. This hookup with the Columbia police officer was so secret that Andy did not even have a name.
This discovery shocked investigators. Determining the identity of this officer had now become the top priority. They had to know who this officer was. If there was supposed to be an officer on staff having a relationship with Jesse Valencia, they would most certainly have come forward after hearing that their partner that they were hooking up with was murdered. The fact that no officer came forward made this unnamed officer extremely suspicious.
Sus.
Yeah. Although Andy did not have a name for this Columbia police officer, they asked him to come back down to the station to look through officer photos in hopes that he could point out their mystery suspect. For Andy, looking at the photos was unnecessary because he was able to identify the officer as he walked past him going into the interrogation room. Now, this mystery officer was none other than Officer Stephen Rios, the same police officer we mentioned earlier who had arrested Jesse at the house party just a few months earlier.
So with the help of Jesse's mother, police were able to identify a girl that Jesse had always hung around with and was sort of his best friend, you could say. Her name was Joan Sheridan. Joan was interviewed by police and asked if she knew about the secret relationship with the police officer. She was one of the very few people that were aware of this. She confirms that he had been seeing Rios after his arrest, and he would normally come over between 4 to 6 a.m. to hook up and leave. It was what Joan said after that finally gave the police their motive for a murder. Jesse had assumed since he was hooking up with his arresting officer that his disorderly conduct charge would be dropped. However, the charge continued to stick rather than going away. So his plan was to go to the police chief, essentially blackmailing him about their relationship.
Stephen Rios was a 5-year officer with the Columbia Police Department. He had a wife and a baby that was only a couple months old at home. He became the main suspect as a married man who was being accused of sleeping with someone they arrested and then was found murdered, as well as never coming forward about their relationship. After denying that he knew Valencia outside of the one arrest, interrogators were able to give him a break, and he admitted that they were involved in a relationship. Rios had an alibi, though. For that night in question, he said he was getting off his shift around 3 a.m., and then he had some beers with other officers before getting home a little after 5 a.m. Now, all this checked out except for one small detail. Rios left the station and arrived 45 minutes after that his card showed him clocking out. And this is concerning because his drive from the station to his house was only 3 minutes. So there were 42 unaccounted minutes in his alibi that allowed more than enough time for a murder to occur. Despite the affair with the murder victim, as well as the holes in his alibi, there was no actual evidence pinning him to the murder, so he was released.
Shortly after his release, the police chief received a phone call from Rios. Rios was very distraught and claimed to have done a very bad thing. At this point, guilt's gotta be eaten at him. Rios was suicidal and was threatening to shoot himself. Thankfully, the police chief was able to talk him down and have him come into the station, where he was then admitted to a mental hospital. After arriving to the mental hospital that Rios was admitted to, he escaped onto the top of the parking garage and was now threatening to jump.
Yeah, this became a full spectacle. There was a crowd that gathered around. I was watching this documentary, and there was actually video of people on the ground just recording them.
Jump.
Well, it didn't have sound, but he's just standing up there. I'm not sure if he actually wanted to jump, but
yeah, just chilling.
To make a show.
Yeah, just make a show. Okay, so he was eventually talked down once again and was then placed on suicide watch.
Skipping forward to the trial, remember earlier in this case when we mentioned the hair on Jesse's chest as well as the DNA under his fingernails?
Yeah.
Now, there was no match at first, but upon taking in Rios, the DNA was a match to him.
Of course.
So Rios had a secret relationship with a former arrestee who was later murdered. Rios never came forward after the murder victim was identified. There was the 42-minute gap in his alibi, and now DNA evidence that tied the murder victim back to him.
Dead to rights.
Investigators believe Rios showed up for a hookup early that morning, but instead he was confronted by Jesse with the threats of going to the police chief, and from there, argument that the neighbor heard ensued, leading to Jesse running away, and then he was chased down, and then Rios choked him from behind, and while he was unconscious, that's when he cut his throat, which ended up being the cause of death. It took a week for the jury to find him guilty, and he was given life in prison. Now, I wanted to go back and mention a few things that didn't really fit into the story we were telling, but just some stuff that I found out. So Andy identified that it was a police officer, but he didn't know the name. And then he ended up going back, and it was like a day after, to identify who the cop was. And between that time, the cops knew that there was a cop involved or had suspicions. So they interviewed some of Jesse's friends, and they knew he was sleeping with a married police officer, but they didn't have a name either, other than Jesse just saying that his name was Anderson. Now, there was only one Anderson on the police force, and it was a Ted Anderson. So he was brought in for questioning. Just some random cop. So apparently someone stole his name tag, which we're guessing is now Rios.
Okay.
And he ended up being crossed off quickly after because he had an alibi, but I found that interesting that it was actually a cop before Rios brought in.
Huh.
Yeah, so when they started, had their suspicions that there was another cop involved, they shut down all communications about the case outside of the investigators.
Of course.
Yeah, so they didn't want anyone to know any information on it. One thing I found interesting was they saw that a cop, the morning of the murder, before the body was even found, went into their police system that they have for bodies found and identified, and they searched his name. They searched Jesse Valencia body, and there was nothing in there. But then they came back a couple hours later after it was. So there was someone, they knew that someone was looking into find if the body was found and identified.
Very interesting. All right. So that's this week's case of Jesse Valencia in the state of Missouri. Dakota, we've talked a little bit about Missouri, the things you can do, the things you can see. Second in murder per capita, we have the dangerous city in the USA. Some infamous murders. So last week we had a big state for you. Washington finished in the top 10. Now, as far as travel goes, when you decide to start setting out on all 50 states, where would you personally rank Missouri on your desired states to see?
This is one of the very few states that, after researching, I've had a gain interest in going. Yeah, some things you mentioned look pretty cool. I'll have to look more in the amusement park, but that sounds cool. The Titanic Museum would be awesome to go to. Ozarks, that was our show. We always got together when that came out. Even though it wasn't... I want to see the real Ozarks.
Sure.
After watching the show. So I'm going to put Missouri... I'm going to put them at 9. So another top 10.
Another top 10.
Yeah.
Okay. Heading to the middle USA for some Missouri. Maybe you catch a Cardinals game. Also, I do want to mention, I am not the brightest. And I was always under the assumption that Kansas City Royals, Kansas City Chiefs were all located in the state of Kansas. Actually, also located in the state of Missouri. So if you're a sports fan, you can catch Royals game, Cardinals game, or a Chiefs game. But
yeah, that was actually a recent discovery. I would say within the last 5 years, I found out that Kansas City actually spread through 2 states.
Okay. All right. So I'm not the only one. I appreciate you.
It is weird. The main part is in Missouri, though.
Yeah. All right. Well, as we begin our departure from the state of Missouri, in conclusion of episode 9 of 50 States, 50 Murders, we want to just continue to thank you, the listeners, for tuning in and supporting us. Each and every week, we'll continue covering a new state as well as a new murder that happened to take place there.
If you have not already, please be sure to follow and subscribe, and be sure to tune in next week for episode 10.